After the Battle of Fort Sumter, 4 more Southern states decided to join the Confederacy. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas joined South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. These 11 Southern states organized a new government with a constitution, a Congress, and a new president. Jefferson Davis became the president of the Confederacy. Davis had been a U.S. Senator from Mississippi and the former U.S. Secretary of War. Davis and the other government officials decided to move the capital of the Confederacy from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. At this time, Richmond was the second largest city in the South. Confederate leaders also used it as a way to bribe Virginia into joining the Confederacy. Plus, many people wanted the capital to be in Virginia since Virginia was associated with the first settlement and colony in America. Many people felt like this would give the Confederate States more legitimacy. This would also put the capital of the Confederacy less than 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. Some saw this as an advantage, while others thought this was a disadvantage. As the South was forming a new government, Lincoln and the North were getting ready to attack. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 men to join the United States Army to put down the rebellion in South Carolina. People came from New England all the way down to Washington, D.C. to join Lincoln's new Union Army. While some border states like Tennessee and Virginia voted to join the Confederacy, other border states like Maryland wanted to remain neutral. Maryland was split between the North and the South. Some people in Maryland wanted slavery to remain legal. Others wanted to remain in the Union because of the large presence of federal soldiers stationed in Annapolis, Maryland. About a week after the Battle of Fort Sumter, the people of Maryland began talking about joining the Confederacy. People throughout the state of Maryland were split. Fighting began breaking out in the streets between pro-Northern protesters and pro-Southern protesters. On Friday, April the 19th, 1861, just 7 days after the Battle of Fort Sumter, soldiers from New England were traveling through Maryland on their way to Washington, D.C. to answer Lincoln's call for 75,000 more troops. As these soldiers began traveling through Baltimore, pro-Southern protesters found out that the Union troops were coming, and they wanted to stop them from reaching Washington, D.C. The pro-Southern protesters began attacking the soldiers from New England. A riot broke out in the streets of Baltimore. 4 soldiers and 12 civilians were killed in the riot. Abraham Lincoln did not want Maryland to join the Confederacy. This would cut off Washington, D.C. from the northern states. Lincoln knew he had to do something to keep Maryland in the Union. A few days after the riot, Abraham Lincoln sent thousands of federal troops to occupy Baltimore. Lincoln had learned that government officials in Baltimore were going to try to secede, and he wanted to stop this. Once the federal troops arrived in Baltimore, Lincoln declared martial law in the state of Maryland. He had the Baltimore mayor, police chief, and city council arrested and imprisoned so they could not vote to secede. When the Maryland state government attempted to meet at the Capitol to discuss what Lincoln had done, Lincoln had them arrested and thrown in jail too, so that they couldn't vote on secession. While the state of Maryland had actually voted to remain neutral, Lincoln and the federal government had actually secured the state for the North by force. Lincoln wanted to go on the offensive after securing Maryland. People in the North wanted Lincoln to quickly go on the attack against the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Many people believed that if the Union could capture Richmond, it would end the war quickly. Lincoln ordered his generals to march south from Washington, D.C. toward Richmond, Virginia. But the Confederates found out that they were coming, so the Confederates began marching north towards Washington, D.C. The two sides met between the two capitals just north of a town called Manassas in northern Virginia, just 25 miles from Washington, D.C. Both sides entered the battle with about 30,000 soldiers, but only about 18,000 on each side participated. The Confederate Army, led by Thomas Jackson, stood their ground, earning Jackson the nickname Stonewall. Stonewall Jackson and the Confederates held their ground. This caused the Union Army to go into a panic. The Federal soldiers were sent running in an unorganized retreat back to Washington, D.C. The Confederate soldiers had won the battle. The Confederate States of America had won the first major battle of the Civil War, and both sides realized that the war would not have a quick end.